Hello, welcome to Mountain Jim Card Collectibles. So, we're past the middle of the week, I should say. And I always keep an eye on, sports card news. But one thing about sports cards and sports card news that I've always noticed, and I noticed it in the 1980s, in the 90s, whatever, is and it's not just me who notices, the sports card news. There are, like, say my ex-girlfriends from, high school and beyond. They notice the sports card news too, but the sports card news that they notice is typically different than the sports card news that I would notice. And what is that? Well, I grew up here in Montana, and let's just face it, if you haven't lived up here and you haven't chased women up here, well, you might be confused because most women up here are only focused on a few things. They like men from big wealthy families, and they like men who have lots of money. And if you don't fall into those categories, well, good luck. Maybe it's just a lot of the women that I tend to hook up with that are focused on capital revenue over, say, who the person really is that they're chasing. So I typically don't talk about sports cards to women up here because they tend to believe that you have to be some guy that's like a millionaire who has like $1 million cards, $1 million sales. And to me, the corporate journalism world kind of gives sports cards and a lot of collectors a black eye in that respect. Because the journalism world's kind of creating, this ideal of, well, if you're into sports cards, it's all about the money. And that takes me to this article. And, this came out a few weeks ago on Reddit. I read a few weeks ago, but, when I was doing this little story I'm going over today, I figured, well, this is a great one to go over. So, like it says here, my buddy knows I am really into sports card, and his son recently found his collection of basketball cards from 1990. I hated to be the one to burst his bubble. Well, then why burst his bubble? Why not just let him enjoy the moment? So like it says here, he texted me a video of his son going through his binder of old basketball cards from the early 90s that he had just found. And both of them were so excited. They had some Skybox and NBA hoops and had a few Jordans and top loaders without penny sleeves. Well, that's a lot of the type of cards that I owned, late 80s, 90s, whatever, And I've tried selling a lot of those cards, and a lot of those cards won't sell, but anyway. We have kept this stuff in a way for over 30 years. How much do you think this stuff was worth? My response started something like this. So let me tell you a story about the trading card companies and how they kind of slightly overprinted some cards. Like it says here, from about 1990 to 95, I collected baseball cards nonstop, had them all organized as some of the high dollar cards and sleeves. I had no idea about overprinting. I bought card value guides and everything. When I got into college, I forgot all about them, and then years later, my parents were going to move and wanted them out of the closets. It sure was a shock to find out that my treasure trove was anything but that, but it was pretty cool sorting back through them and saving some that had some legitimate value, $10 to $15 type value. I sold a few, kept a binder of my favorites. The real killer was trying to give away the cards. I tried everywhere, and no one even wanted to give their kid a stack or two. I dumped over 20,000 cards in the dumpster. It killed me. So why put them into a dumpster? Why not just hold on to them? Anyway, it killed me, even though they were basically worthless, but I can rely on knowing the memories of opening new packs and point out my favorites. That was real value. It really cemented my love for the game. And this is one of the issues that I take with sports cards, supposed sports card collectors. At the end of the day, it seems to be more about value. And, you can hit, this is like from Sports Collectors Digest, and you can just hit mainstream corporate media news. And it's always going to be, articles more or less about this, about these big, massive, expensive chases. This rare one of one Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant Logo Man card set to break hobby record. And I'm not sure if you've seen this one before. This is a beautiful card. I mean, anybody would be thrilled to own this card. And it is what it is. I mean, it's going to be an expensive, card. And like it says here, has a bid of $6.77 million. Now, that's quite a different take on cards than what we just went over with all the basketball cards, NBA hoops, skybox that someone pulls out of their closet and they're excited about it, and they're happy to be going through it, but then someone has to come in and basically state that, well, there isn't any value there. Well, to the outside corporate world, to corporate media, and I don't like corporate media. I used to be a journalist. I've had to deal with corporations. That's one of the reasons I stepped away from journalism, is because what I realized when I was working for this corporate media owned newspaper is they don't like a lot of objectivity in their news. They're very subjective, and a lot of people want to believe that, a lot of news is objective, but a lot of it is subjective. And so when you see these media companies only hyping up the most expensive of the expensive sports cards, because that's the big news, to me, it really puts a chill on the sports card collecting community overall. Why? Because it's like you go to a show, you say like me, you're talking to women, and I'll say, don't bring up sports cards to women because they're so, they might notice, past articles, and it's always this corporate media showing out, the most expensive card sales in history. And if you're not one of those guys, if you're not one of these people who collect like that, you're just, to an extent, in the USA, looked at as a complete joke. And so this is one of the things about card collecting that I wish I could change, but I really can't. And that has to do with, look at this hyper focus on money in the USA. Especially right now under Donald Trump, as a president, he's the me generation guy from the 80s, he still is the me generation guy. But, it's always people like me who don't come from the wealthy families, who don't have, millions of dollars, that why am I not always excited to go to sports card sales? Well, a lot of times, I'll just meet people at these sports card events or whatever that are just so hyper focused on the most expensive cards out there that anything else, like I say earlier, you're just looked at as a complete joke. Go there with a box of 90s cards, they will laugh you out of the sports card event. But why is that? If you like the cards, if you look at the cards and they bring you good memories, why is it that in the USA that they just can't respect that? Well, the USA has a rough history, and I know that our current presidential administration is trying to sweep that under the rug to an extent at the Smithsonian Museum. But we have a history that's built on money, 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 and God forbid you don't have a lot of it. Well, what I found is I almost feel like I should be living in a smaller country. I'll be honest. At my age, at age 50, at the way, what I've seen in my lifetime, the way that things are going, would I be better, in a small country? Because a lot of small countries don't have this hyper focus on money like we do in the USA. Where, I always like to think of my high school girlfriend. I was great for her in high school, just after high school, but she came from a very wealthy, $1 million type family. Her dad was a wealthy doctor. And the speech she gave me basically when she broke up with me is, well, I didn't come from a wealthy enough family. I don't make enough money. At the time, I was a body man painter, and she did not like the way I'd come home from working at my job because I would be covered in, paint, plastic dust, dirt, and someone, that came from an expensive neighborhood, her dad bought her brand new cars, when she was in high school. Her dad bought her a house just after high school. I came off like a complete joke. I'm just your typical working man, go to work, I'm dirty, filthy dirt. And that's how she began to look at me. And I had sports cards back then, but, she'd laugh kind of about that too. Why? Because in the late 80s, early 90s, the damn corporate media was hyping up the same stuff. Only these big, massive sales, And if you're not one of those people, well, you're just looked at as a joke overall. Now here I am going over some of these sales, this is, like the list of most expensive sports cards. Yeah. And that's about the only damn thing that people care about in this hobby, isn't it? So let's get into this a little bit. So here's a sale from August 28, 2022. That's adjusted price. Original price was a $12,600,000 sale for a Mickey Mantle card. And if you're going to talk to women, especially up here in Montana, that's what it's going to take. So you don't want to talk about sports cards with women up here, or probably a lot of places, because, they probably have about the same expectations. Here we have this old Honus Wagner card, that was sold for $7,250,000, followed by a Babe Ruth, $7,200,000. It's just, you're not good enough. You're not good enough. You're not good enough. Why am I not good enough? Because you don't have enough money. Okay, well, clearly there is a distortion in the way that people look at each other in the U.S., because they tend to look at a lot of people just strictly along those merits. How productive are you? How much money do you have? How, big of expensive cards do you own? And if you don't live up to their ideals from the hobby itself, from the corporate media, from just wealthy people who come from wealthy families who never really had to work for anything in their lives, that's back to me working at a body shop, and just being covered in dirt and paint, and, I'm your typical, working man. Anyway, how do you feel about the view from the corporate media world and just the hobby itself, of always degrading people who don't have as much money or who take pride in cards that maybe are overprinted in comparison to, say, the breakers of today who always have the cameras on them, are always hooping and hollering for every, break card that they come up with, an autograph that they can shill out for millions of dollars. And they had to get in the box, for thousands of dollars to begin with, Like I said, I just feel like at my stage in life, for what the U.S. has become, I just like to move to a small little country where money isn't very important, and they tend to focus more on people, family, whatever, than just looking at an individual solely on the basis of what is in their bank account and what sort of wealthy family they were born into. Anyway, if you feel differently, leave some comments. I always like to thank my subscribers. I'd like to thank all my viewers as well. If you haven't subscribed as a viewer, it's 100% free. Helps keep the channel going. Anyway, hope you tune again for the next episode of Mountain Jim Card Collectibles. I'm out of here. Bye.